Have you ever done everything right? Worked every extra shift, skipped every vacation, gone without, so that the people you love could have more, only to find out that more was never enough for them? I'm 63 years old. I live in a semi-detached house in Hamilton, Ontario, that still has the same kitchen tiles I installed myself in 1998 because I kept putting off renovating it. I kept putting it off because there was always something else that needed the money first. A tuition payment, a car repair, a security deposit, and always, it was for my son, Liam. I want to be honest with you from the start. This isn't a story where I'm entirely blameless. I made choices. I kept writing checks when I probably should have stopped years earlier. But I made those choices from love. The kind of bone-deep, exhausting love that only parents understand. And I truly believed, that it was temporary. That Liam would find his footing. That his wife, Sabrina, would eventually see me as something other than an obstacle in their life. I was wrong on both counts. My husband Dennis passed away in the winter of 2011. Liam was 24 at the time, living in a shared house in Guelph, working part-time at a sporting goods store while figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. Dennis had been the steady one. An electrician with a union pension, careful with money in the way that people who grew up without it tend to be. When he died of a sudden cardiac event on a Tuesday morning in February, I lost not just my husband but the person who balanced me out. Who would look over my shoulder when I was about to do something financially foolish and say, gently, "Bev, think about this." Dennis left me with the house, a modest life insurance payout, and a pension that I'd have to stretch carefully. It was enough to live on. Not lavishly. I kept working my job as an administrative coordinator at a steel company until I retired 3 years ago, but enough. For the first year after Dennis died, Liam and I leaned on each other in the way that grief forces people to do. He'd drive up from Guelph on weekends and we'd sit in the kitchen, and I'd make too much food, and he'd eat it, and we'd talk about his father. And sometimes we'd just sit quietly, and that was enough. Those were good months, in the middle of the hard ones. Then he met Sabrina at a friend's birthday party in the spring of 2012. I want to be fair. I genuinely tried with Sabrina. I invited her to Thanksgiving that first year. And she came, and she was polite and pretty, and laughed easily, and I thought, this is good. Liam is happy. This is what matters. She worked in marketing at a mid-sized company in Toronto, and she had opinions about everything. Restaurants, neighborhoods, other people's decor choices, delivered with a brightness that I initially mistook for enthusiasm. It took me longer than it should have to understand that what I was hearing underneath the brightness was judgment. She judged my house. Not out loud. Never out loud. But in the way she'd glance around when she arrived, the way she'd pause a half-second too long before sitting down on my sofa, the way she once described my neighborhood to someone on the phone as older, with a specific tone of voice that made the word mean something it didn't literally say. I noticed. I told myself it didn't matter. People come from different backgrounds. She was young. Liam proposed to Sabrina in the fall of 2013. He called me the night before to tell me, nervous and sweet, and I cried happy tears and told him I was so glad for him. I meant it. And then, 3 days later, he called again. More carefully this time, to talk about the wedding. The wedding they had in mind cost $42,000. Liam was working as a sales associate by then, making decent but not exceptional money. Sabrina had a better salary, but as I would come to understand, her philosophy about money was that it was for spending, not saving. They had no wedding fund. What they had was an expectation, a gentle, reasonable sounding, impossible to argue, with expectation that his mother would help. I helped. I put in $18,000. I told myself it was what Dennis would have wanted. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a starting-off gift, and after this they'd be on their own. I stood at that wedding in my navy dress and watched my son marry a woman who had seated me at the third table from the front, not the first, and told myself it was a seating logistics issue and not a statement. After the wedding, they settled into a rental in Mississauga. A nice rental. 2 bedrooms. New building. Underground parking. The rent was $2,400 a month. Liam's income alone couldn't quite cover it and also cover the car payments and also cover the lifestyle that Sabrina had grown accustomed to and also save anything. So within 6 months of the wedding, the requests started. never large amounts at once. That's what I want you to understand about how this works. It's not one dramatic ask. It's 100 small ones, each individually reasonable, each framed as temporary. Mom, the car needs new brakes. We're a bit short this month. Could you lend us $600? Mom, Sabrina's work trip overlapped with a billing cycle, and we're dealing with a cash flow thing. Could you transfer $2,200 just until next week? Mom, we found an apartment in a better school district. Yes, already. They're thinking ahead. But the new deposit is $4,000 and we don't have the overlap. Is there any way? I said yes. Every time, I said yes. I justified it to myself in the way that parents do. Liam was my only child. What was I saving my money for, if not for him? I was still working. I had the pension. The house was paid off. I could afford to help. But underneath that justification, if I'm being truthful with myself, there was also something else. Fear. Fear that if I said no, I'd lose what little access I had. Because even then, even before everything that happened later, my relationship with Sabrina Ford was a negotiation I was always losing. She controlled the calendar. If I wanted to see Liam, I worked around her schedule. If I suggested a Sunday dinner, she'd confirm and then cancel the day before with a reason that was always plausible. She was tired. She had a work deadline. They had plans with her friends that she'd forgotten to mention. I started to understand that the invitations I received to their home were rationed. I got Christmas. I got Liam's birthday. Occasionally an Easter. Everything else required an extended campaign of gentle asking that often came to nothing. And then in 2019, Sabrina was pregnant. When Liam called to tell me, I sat down at my kitchen table and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since Dennis died. Happy tears. Genuinely, completely happy tears. I was going to be a grandmother. I started planning immediately in the way that grandmothers do. I thought about the quilt I'd sew, the chair I'd buy for their nursery, the stories I'd read, the things I'd teach. I thought about having a small person in my life who would love me simply and completely in the way that grandchildren do when nobody has told them not to, yet. My grandchild was born in March of 2020, the worst possible month for visitors, right as the world shut down. I understood. I waited. I video called and sent gifts and waited some more. When the first lockdown lifted enough for cautious visits, I drove to Mississauga with a car full of things I'd been collecting for months. Blankets, books, a music box I'd found at an antique shop in Dundas that played a lullaby my own mother had sung to me. Sabrina met me at the door. The baby, my grandchild, my Liam's child, was in her arms, awake, looking around with that unfocused, curious gaze that newborns have. It's so good to finally. I started, reaching out. Sabrina stepped back, not dramatically, just enough. We're being really careful still, she said. With who holds her? I stood on the doorstep of my son's home with my arms half extended, and I heard what she said, and something in me went very quiet. I didn't make a scene. I went inside. I sat at their kitchen island. White marble, recently installed, something I'd helped pay for without being told it was going to be a renovation. And I looked at my grandchild from a careful distance. Sabrina held her the entire time. When the baby fussed, she turned away from me to settle her. When I asked if I could hold her, Sabrina said she'd just gotten her calm and she didn't want to disrupt it. Liam was there, and he said nothing. He made tea, and he talked about the baby's sleep schedule, and he did not meet my eyes. I drove home, and I sat in my car in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. Over the following months, it happened again and again. I would visit, and the baby would be just settled, or coming down with something, or Sabrina would be right in the middle of a feeding schedule she didn't want to disrupt. My grandchild grew. Started sitting up. Started reaching for things. I watched it happen through a phone screen, and through a careful 2-meter gap across a living room. I held her, properly held her, skin to skin, close, exactly twice in her first year of life. And through all of it, the money kept going out. I want you to understand the timeline here, because it matters. While I was being kept at arm's length from my own grandchild, I was still receiving the calls. The car needed work. They were looking at a house, a real house in Oakville, a market that was moving fast, and they needed help with the down payment. Just a bridge. Just temporary. I gave $40,000 toward that house. I took it out of the investment account Dennis had left me, the one I'd promised myself I'd only touch for emergencies. I told myself it was an investment in their stability. in my grandchild's stability. I told myself that once they were settled, once the stress of renting was gone, things would ease between us. I told myself Sabrina would soften, that Liam would find his voice. I told myself a lot of things in those years. The house was lovely. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with a deck. Sabrina sent me photos when they moved in. I was not invited to help them move, but I received photos. In the winter of 2022, I was having coffee with my friend Wendy Alcott. We've known each other since our children were in primary school together. And I was telling her about my latest visit to Oakville, the one where Sabrina had kept the baby in the playroom the entire time I was there. And Liam had seemed agitated and distracted in a way I couldn't quite read. Wendy listened. She'd heard versions of this story before. "How much have you given them total?" she asked. I had to think about it. I'd never added it up. It came to me in pieces: the wedding, the deposits, the car, the house. And when I said the number out loud, Wendy set her coffee down. "Beverly," she said. "She's one of the few people who still uses my full name. That's not helping. That's being managed." I drove home with that sentence sitting in my chest like a stone. I started paying closer attention after that. Not out of suspicion exactly, or maybe exactly out of suspicion, and I was just not willing to name it yet. I noticed that the financial requests had a pattern. They came after visits where I'd been particularly shut out. They came with Liam's voice, but I started to hear Sabrina's phrasing in them. "We've been dealing with some cash flow issues," was not how my son had ever talked before he married her. "The timing is just really challenging right now." Liam had never said challenging to describe anything in his life. I started asking questions I hadn't asked before. I asked Liam to send me the mortgage documents when they'd bought the house, saying I wanted to understand what I'd contributed to. He hesitated. He said he'd send them later. He didn't. In the early months of 2023, my retired neighbor Frank, a man who'd worked in finance for 30 years before he stopped, mentioned casually over our mutual fence one evening that he'd heard from his sons, who worked in the same industry corridor as some people Liam knew, that there were rumors about a company Liam had co-founded quietly, without mentioning it to me, using funds he'd apparently sourced from somewhere. The company was promising investors returns on short-term real estate flips. Some of those investors were unhappy. I did not sleep that night. The next morning I called a lawyer named Paul Grayson, whose number Wendy had once given me for a completely different matter. I told Paul what I knew and what I suspected. He listened carefully and then he said, "The first question is whether any of the money you transferred was documented as a loan versus a gift. None of it was documented as anything. It had all been trust. Informal, family." Paul referred me to a forensic accountant named Dr. Harriet Sue. Doc. Sue was brisk and methodical, and did not soften anything she said, which was exactly what I needed. Over the course of several weeks, she helped me trace where my contributions had gone. The wedding money, that was simply spent, nothing unusual there, but to distract them. The $40,000 for the house down payment had moved in ways that did not make sense for a down payment. It had gone into an account jointly held by Liam and Sabrina. Then a portion had been transferred to a numbered company registered in Ontario, under a director whose name I didn't recognize. That director, Dr. Sue found, was Sabrina's brother. Sabrina had a brother I had met exactly once at the wedding, briefly. He was apparently now the registered director of a holding company that had received a portion of the money I'd given my son to buy his family a home. I sat in Dr. Sue's office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and I looked at the papers she'd laid out in front of me, and I thought about every visit where Sabrina had stepped back when I reached for my grandchild. Every canceled Sunday dinner, every Christmas where I'd been seated, politely, just slightly outside the center of things. Every phone call with my son where he'd sounded like a man reading from a script someone else had written. And I thought, how long have I been paying for my own exclusion? The answer, as best as Dr. Sue and I could work out, was approximately 4 years. I went home. I did not call Liam that night. I sat in the kitchen with the old tiles, and I had a glass of wine. And I looked at the photo of Dennis that sits on the shelf above the microwave, the one from our trip to Cape Breton in 2004. And I talked to him quietly the way I still do, sometimes when things are very hard. "What would you do?" I asked him. I knew what he'd say. He'd say, "Stop." The next morning I called my bank. I removed Liam from the secondary access he'd had on one of my accounts since Dennis died. Access I'd given him as an emergency measure and never revoked. I called my financial advisor and I reviewed every account and investment with fresh eyes. I contacted Paul Grayson again and asked him what my legal options were. And then I called Liam. He answered on the second ring, bright and normal sounding, the way he always was at the start of calls, before whatever I'd said let him know what kind of call this was going to be. "Hi, Mom, what's up? I'd like to come see you," I said. "Just the two of us, not at your house, somewhere neutral. I'll buy lunch." There was a pause that told me something. He'd heard something in my voice. "Sure," he said. "Everything okay?" "I'd like to talk in person," I said. Cafe on Kerr Street, Thursday at noon. "I'll be there." He came. He sat across from me in a booth, and he looked like my son. My boy. The one I'd driven to hockey practice at 6 a.m, the one who'd climbed into my bed after Dennis's funeral and cried for 2 hours. And I had to remind myself that loving someone and holding them accountable were not opposites. I told him what I'd found. I didn't dramatize, I didn't accuse. I laid it out the way Dr. Sue had laid it out for me. "Here is the money, here is where it went, here is what I don't understand, and I would like you to explain it to me." He tried at first to explain. Then he tried to minimize. Then he went quiet for a long time and looked out the window, and what I saw on his face was not the face of a man who'd been wrongly accused. It was the face of a man who'd been caught. He told me eventually, haltingly, that the numbered company had been Sabrina's idea, that she'd told him it was a legitimate investment structure, that he'd trusted her. He said he hadn't known she'd moved money through her brother. He said a lot of things that were partly true and partly the story a person tells themselves when they've done something they can't fully look at straight on. I listened to all of it. Then I told him what I'd decided. I would not be providing any further financial support. Not a bridge loan, not an emergency transfer, not help with any future move or renovation or school registration. The support was finished. I told him that I also needed, for my own health and well-being, to step back from a relationship that had cost me more than money. I told him that I loved him completely and that I would always be his mother, and that those two things were consistent with what I was telling him. And then I told him the part I'd thought the hardest about. I would like to have a real relationship with my grandchild, I said. Not a supervised visit from across a room. I would like to be in her life properly. That's not negotiable for me, not financially, not in any other way. If that's not something Sabrina is willing to consider, then I'll need to talk to Paul about what options I have legally as a grandparent in Ontario. Liam looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know she was doing that." "Which part?" I asked. He didn't answer. We sat in the booth until our coffee went cold. The weeks after that conversation were not clean or simple. And I want to be honest about that, because I think these stories often get told as if the moment of decision is the resolution. It isn't. It's the beginning of a different and harder chapter. Sabrina called me 3 days later. She was controlled and cold in the way that people are when they've decided that the best defense is offense. She told me I had a history of meddling. She told me I'd never made her feel welcome. She told me that my financial assistance had always come with strings, and that the reason she'd been careful about the baby was that she hadn't wanted her daughter growing up with the kind of emotional manipulation she'd witnessed in our family. I let her talk. I had learned by then not to argue with Sabrina Forda in real time, because she was better at it than me, and because nothing I said would land the way I meant it anyway. When she finished, I said, "Thank you for telling me how you felt. I'd still like to discuss access to my granddaughter." There was a long silence. "I'll talk to Liam," she said. She hung up. The months that followed were a slow rearrangement. Liam and Sabrina, without my financial cushion, began to feel the weight of a life built on a foundation that couldn't hold itself up. I heard things from Wendy, who heard things through the networks that small cities run on. The Oakville house went on the market in the fall. There were conversations about what Sabrina's brother's company had actually done with the money it held. I gave Paul Grayson the documentation Dr. Sue had compiled, and Paul filed the appropriate paperwork to begin recovering what could be recovered. I am not going to pretend I felt nothing about watching my son's life contract under its own weight. I felt everything. I cried. I second-guessed myself at 3 a.m, more times than I can count. I thought about calling him and saying, "Forget it. I'll help. I'll figure something out." I thought about that on many nights. But I thought about my grandchild, too. About the way she'd looked at me across a room she was not allowed to cross to reach me. About all the mornings I'd missed, all the firsts I'd watched through a phone screen when I could have been there. About the music box from the antique shop in Dundas, still sitting in a bag in my hall closet because I'd never been invited close enough to give it to her properly. And I thought about Dennis at the kitchen counter, saying, "Bev, think about this." In January of this year, Liam called me on a Sunday evening. He sounded different, hollowed out, quieter, like a person who had been through something and come out the other side, still standing, but without whatever had kept him inflated before. He said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have the right words for yet," I said. "Okay," he said. "Sabrina and I are separating." I didn't know what to say to that except, "I'm sorry, Liam." "I know," he said. "Mom, can I bring Isla to see you next Saturday?" I had to ask him to repeat himself. "Isla," he said. And I realized in that moment that I had never, not once, in the 3 years since my granddaughter was born, heard Liam say her name to me as part of a question about a visit. It had always been, "We'll try to get up there," or "The timing hasn't been great," or nothing at all. "Yes," I said. "Please." He brought her on a Saturday in the pale gray light of a January afternoon. She was 3 years old by then, and she walked up my front path in a red coat with toggles on it, and she stopped at my doorstep and looked up at me with her father's eyes. Dennis's eyes, going back, and she said, "You have a green door." "I do," I said. "Do you like green?" She considered this seriously, the way 3-year-olds consider things. "It's okay," she said. And then she walked past me into my house like she'd always known where she was going. I put the kettle on, and I got out the wooden spoons and the bowls, the ones from the low cupboard that children can reach, and we made banana muffins together while Liam sat at the kitchen table and watched us. And he had an expression on his face that I didn't try to read. At some point during the second batch, Isla climbed up onto my lap to look into the mixing bowl, and she smelled like the particular combination of shampoo and outside air that small children have. And I held her, properly, completely, without anyone stepping back. And I thought about the 3 years it had taken to get to this kitchen on this Saturday afternoon, and I thought about how strange it is that you can love someone beyond all reason and still have to learn, late and painfully, where the line is. The music box is on her dresser at her father's new apartment now. He took it with him when I finally brought it out of the closet and gave it to him with no explanation. He held it for a long time before he said anything. "This is beautiful. Mom, it was your grandmother's," I told him. "Well, the song was. I found this one at a shop. I've been saving it." He looked at me. "Since when?" "Since before she was born. We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. I'm not going to tell you that everything is fixed, because it isn't. The legal process around the money is ongoing and slow, and there are no guarantees about what I'll recover. My son is rebuilding a life that partially collapsed because he let someone else make decisions for him that he should have owned himself. Those are not small things, and they will take time that none of us can shortcut. But I see Isla every second Saturday now. She knows how to find the low cupboard, and she has strong opinions about sprinkles, and she calls me, entirely of her own invention, without anyone suggesting it, Gran. Not Grandma, not Grammy, Gran. Like she thought about it and picked the one that fit. I don't know what the next years will look like. I know that I'm done writing checks that buy me temporary access to people who should love me without a cover charge. I know that I stopped, eventually, and that stopping was the most frightening and correct thing I've ever done on my own, without Dennis beside me to say, "Bev, think about this." I thought about it. I lived it through to the other side, and every second Saturday, a small person in a red coat with toggles walks up my front path and calls me Gran. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.